My name is Rabbi Daniel Sher. I'm filling in for Rabbi Amy Bernstein this week. She will be back next week with her regularly scheduled Torah study. And this week we will spend some time together looking at the first parsha of our book of, anyone know?
Bamidbar.
Bamidbar. Always a fun endeavor to, before you even can open up and look for a word, ask yourself why we choose the words not in the Hebrew. We know the word Bamidbar in Hebrew means in the desert, in the wilderness, and we'll look at that. But we have to ask ourselves, how did we get to the English words, meaning words like Numbers, which is the name of the portion in English? So the first thing to ask is, like, why wouldn't we just do a direct translation? Why wouldn't we just take the words of our text, Bereshit, Shmot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, Devarim? These words are apt and specific and carry a really nice teaching.
Well,
so why do we start by calling it Numbers?
I thought you say you call it Bamidbar.
I call it Bamidbar, but if you ask for the English of the name of this book of our Torah, the English of this book is called Numbers.
I like Bamidbar better because
Wasn't there a Greek translation?
And we're coming out of a mental desert.
Correct.
Into history and belief.
Correct. Bert, what were you saying?
Well, I was going to say the first thing that happens is that there's a census and the Israelites are counted. And wasn't there I think it was a Greek translation that named it something like Numbers, and then the English followed that?
Right. So that's where we're going, is when you think about the study of Torah, unlike a lot of other studies, when you learn Torah, you're learning in a way in which you're taking input from all different spaces and directions, and you're not holding one common thread of, let's say, one common thread of this is the line of expertise that I would follow if I had a question about that. So because of it, Torah is somewhat decentralized in its notion of where we gain our knowledge of Torah from. And we know that because the rabbis similarly collect information from all these different rabbis, though one could argue that there's there is some, system to how they pick inside of, the Gemara, but there is all different kinds of perspectives. So yes, based on the original translations, the translations from those translations, we end up with this idea of Numbers, and it does fit because of the census. However, let's call all the rambling that I just said what it is. That's a perspective. It's an opinion. It's a interpretation. The minute you choose what to call the text, you're giving some layer of interpretation to the way you're going to read it. So what I think we need to do today is start with what it really means and why it's called Bamidbar in the Hebrew. And we can decide from there, are we going to follow that logic, or do we think some of the other interpretations are more sound? The first thing to ask is, what does each book of Torah really stand for? When you're young, you learn Bereshit pretty quickly. It's the story of the families. It's the story of the patriarchs and matriarchs, the creation of the world, the setting the stage and the foundation for our peoplehood. And then Shemot and the Exodus and the Revelation is this idea of us being birthed into being a people and having the opportunity to, now that we have this origin story and background, and now that we've had this collective trauma, we can turn and create this narrative. And then if you go a little bit further, Devarim, right? Deuteronomy is a really helpful one in those translations, because Deuteronomy means what? It means the second telling. But Devarim means stuff, things, important knickknacks and ideas. And Devarim is Moses completely retelling a Cliff Notes version of the importance of our text so that the people don't forget it when they're in Israel. Or the king at the time in Israel was realizing that people weren't willing to read the 80,000 word version, and so he made a slimmer one that he thought people would read, and that ends up being Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy becomes this second telling, this long speech, and where things get repeated. And Vayikra, Leviticus, we just finished it, is all the laws of the priesthood and sanctity and the holiness of our tradition. So what is Bamidbar? If Genesis is the origin and Shmot or Exodus is our revelation story, and Vayikra is the holiness of our sanctified laws, and Devarim or Deuteronomy is the second telling, what is Bamidbar or Numbers? Yeah, Susan.
Well, it really is in the wilderness because we're wandering around trying to figure out who we are as a people and where we're going and how to worship our God. And, even to today, when you feel lost, you say, like, I feel like I'm in the wilderness. So I think like in the wilderness would be a perfect name.
Nice. Who else has any thoughts on what the text wants to focus on? I do think there's a real point to that, Susan.
It's also physically where we are, not just mentally.
Beautiful.
We are,
True.
In fact, wandering in the wilderness, and it's not for sure we'll ever get out of the wilderness.
Yeah, I mean,
God says we'll get out of the wilderness, but I don't know that the Israelites thought they would.
So I fully agree with you, with one issue and exception. Let's take a small look here at our map. That's a good one. So right here, you have Israel. And right here, you have Egypt. And this space here is the Sinai Desert. Now, I think I've actually mentioned to some of you before, how large is that space? It's decent size.
I don't know, but it's like a 10-day walk.
Yeah, I think 10 would be maybe being 50. A little bit hard. Yeah. But
I'll give you 20.
It's a month, a 2 month, whatever it is. It certainly is not 40 years, right? It certainly isn't, 480 months of walking to do this little space. There is a famous trail. Let's get out of there now. There's a famous trail in Israel called Svil Israel that goes from the top to the bottom, and people generally can hike it in about 2 months. And that's longer. So yes, we're in the wilderness, and theoretically, we don't know if we'll ever get out of the wilderness, but also like a little sad when you look at what the wilderness looked like. So it can't just be the physical wilderness that the text is wanting to focus on, right? So here's what I'll tell you. Bamidbar is a narrative that happens over 39 years, right? 40 years of in the desert. But all but the first and the last of them, no one talks about. We talk about the first year of their wandering, and we focus a lot on the end of their wandering when Moses is wrestling with a lot of these pieces and realizing he won't go into Israel. But in between then, it's almost as if we don't hear about it. And the same rhythm and cadence that we get to other pieces of text, we don't necessarily get. So unlike the rhetorical structure of Devarim, where it's a speech, or the narrative structure of Bereshit, because it's all these great stories, and Exodus as well, right? The pieces that we're going to get in Bamidbar, which are exciting. You have the spies, you have Korah, you have different wars. They all happen here and there, but they don't happen with the same thread and narrative. And so I always find it kind of interesting that we have this entire piece of Torah, a fifth of our book, 20% of our Torah is this Bamidbar idea, in the desert, in the wilderness, in the nothingness. And so one of the great pieces is to figure out what it really means to be in the wilderness. What does it mean to be Bamidbar? And so there is this piece of text called Bamidbar Rabbah, which is the rabbi's interpretations and midrash and wrestling with the text. It's a midrash on Bamidbar. And the beginning, the opening words, God spoke to Moses in the wilderness in Sinai. Anyone who does not make themselves ownerless like the wilderness is unable to acquire the wisdom of Torah. Therefore, it is said in the wilderness of Sinai. The rabbis jump straight to this idea that it's actually not about the desert itself, but about the job they're going to have to do in the desert, which is to what? Take Torah as theirs. We have our revelation. We started to go over the laws, but now is an implication in which society has to absorb this Torah-ness. Any thoughts or questions on that? Okay. So with this Bamidbar piece, And in this, suppose that talking to God and receiving Torah in the tent in the middle, this is what's going to happen now. At the beginning of our story, where does Moses talk to God? Well, at the very beginning of our story, Moses talks to God in a bush.
Burning bush.
In the desert. And then on a mountain. And then all over the place. And then in front of a sea. Moses has these epic spaces, these beautiful, vast landscapes in which he hears God's voice. But then in Bamidbar, in the portion actually titled Wilderness, where does Moses hear from God? I'll show you. Oh, I zoomed it out there for that. Sorry. There's a little technical difficulty. I see my computer reloading a bunch of times. Here we go. I'm going to share my screen now on some text. Who can read the first 2 lines?
On the first day of the second month in the second year following the exodus from the land of Egypt, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, in the tent of meeting, saying, take a census of the whole Israelite company of fighters by the clans of its ancestral houses, listing the names every male head by head.
Okay. So do me a favor, read the end of the first line one more time.
Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, in the tent of meeting.
Okay. So we get this double piece here. In the wilderness, okay, we're in the wilderness. We've set up the tent. We've learned to have the Mishkan. We've learned to manage the Mishkan. Now the people are walking through the desert with this massively inconvenient structure, which is partially why it would take so long. And where does Moses now have to talk to God? In the tent of the meeting, specifically. That is where Moses now talks to God. In a tent. In this very mundane human space. Not in this breathtaking space anymore. Not in the wilderness where he first hears God's voice. Moses will now converse with God in the tent. In the thing built by the Israelites. Built with love, built with sacredness, built with all those things, sure. But Moses will now speak to God from there.
As we join together in this tent.
Well, I think there's a huge piece of this, right? That our text gives us 3,000-year-old plus interpretation of how to understand a gathering. And that if we wanted to shift this idea of a sacred experience into a communal experience, we had to let place be part of it. But it has to have been a different experience, right? It has to be a vastly different experience for Moses now to be receiving words and encountering God in the tent, as opposed to this original form of the mountain amidst the thunder and the fire and the wilderness. And so there's all of this stuff. And so go back to that Midrash Rabbah again. It says, why does the Torah say Bamidbar Sinai? Why both? Bamidbar, wilderness or desert? Sinai, desert. Why do we need both? And the rabbis are taught that the Torah was given in or through or by 3 things. It's a beautiful piece of text. Fire, water, and desert. Now, how do we know fire? You go back to Exodus 19 and it says that Har Sinai smoked in every part because God descended upon it with fire. Also, we know this because of the cloud and the fire. How do we know water? That comes later on in our text in Judges, but it says the earth trembled and the heavens dropped. The clouds also dropped all the water at the Sinai before God. So we know that now God has this engagement with fire and with water. And lastly, with desert. Why do we know that? We know that from the very beginning of this piece of text. God spoke to Moshe, Bamidbar Sinai. And why is it given through these 3 things? You might be speculating. Just as these things are free for all the inhabitants of the world, there is no restriction. I mean, there's restriction today, unfortunately, on distribution of water. But if you're at water, there is no restriction on water. And water and fire and desert are all accessible throughout this world. And so this is the text that brings us back into a famous piece of Isaiah that says, let everyone who is thirsty come and have water. So despite the fact that God's revelation on Mount Sinai takes place amidst this amazing, spectacular display of these earthly elements, this time it's private and quiet in the desert. So the Midrash goes one step further. The Midrash plays with the text now. It says a different thing. God spoke to Moses, Bamidbar Sinai. This teaches that anyone who does not make themselves like the desert, Bamidbar, is not capable of acquiring the wisdom of Torah, like we said. So here they're playing with the word. Bamidbar is with a bet. Kamidbar would be with a kaf. And the rabbis are saying, maybe we just messed up the letter a little bit. What if it's actually Kamidbar? What if it's asking that we be like the desert? So what is that? What's your initial reaction to being like the desert? What would it mean to receive Torah only if you can be like the desert?
It's wondrous.
Yeah, Susan.
It's my favorite place in the world is the desert. The desert is sparse and beautiful and fertile if you look closely. And full
Now
of
gut
life.
check. Now gut check, because Torah is about a gut check. Who has an initial visceral reaction in almost a negative way? Like that you'd rather be in a fruitful, luscious green space, not to allow oneself to be like desert, to be sparse, to be scarce.
I think the desert is very open.
Okay, no, look, I think there's beautiful interpretation, but the question is whether or not when we initially think about it, if we're willing to see its beauty or if first comes something fearful. For those of you who haven't really walked through the desert, there is something a little bit scary. When I lived in Israel at 25, we went on a 4-day hike in the desert, and some of the people did not understand how much water to be drinking, and we ran out of water. Now, one of the amazing things about living in a place that has this understanding of desert is we walked out to the road, because the deserts aren't so far from a road that takes you down to a lot, and we held our water bottles upside down until a car pulled over and gave us a 6-pack of 2-liter water bottles. And when I turned to my Israeli friend and said, what just happened? He said, we all drive with a 6-pack of water in our trunk in case someone's on the side of the road and needs water. But before that moment, what do you think went through my head? We don't have the resources to do this. We're going to end up dehydrated. All these issues and fears start percolating up from the vastness, from the nothingness. And yet the rabbis are encouraging in this moment that we be kamidbar, what they call hefker, ownerless. Yeah, Bert, you had your hand up before.
Oh no, I said what I wanted to say, but that for me, desert, and after all, LA is a desert. Yeah, desert is about openness and space, and in a way, it's kind of being blank, and that is that you need to approach Torah with an openness and without a lot of presuppositions. Otherwise, you can't get it.
Yeah,
We are all hungry for understanding, like desert for water.
and what happens if we fully quench that thirst, right? There's something really interesting to be asked here, because, but then do we need it again? Is it right? I can quench my thirst in this moment, but it won't be the last time I need to drink water in my entire day. And Torah is this drawn out version of learning. We've talked about this. It's not a big book. If you joined another book club that said they were going to do the first volume of Harry Potter, but they were going to do it over 52 weeks, you'd be like, I don't have time for this. I'm going to read it so much faster. I'll move on to my next book. But this book, we read every year without fail. It's only that long, and we extract new meaning. And the rabbis help with stuff like Midrash Rabbah. They help with these pieces. And the rabbis, again, they say, Kamidbar hefker, to be like the desert, ownerless, or to be like the desert or in the desert as ownerless.
You know, the word hefker is Hebrew, but in Yiddish, it's used as wild.
It is.
Yes.
Interesting. So hefker in the Hebrew truly means ownerless, which, by the way, is a very close interpretation to wild, because much of their conversation and much of their understanding of animals at the time of the creation of Yiddish were what? They were the livestock. So if you were ownerless, you were a wild animal. And if you had an owner, now that same idea, by the way, beautiful interpretation. If you are ownerless, you are without tradition, you are without morality, you are without these things. That's how human can be ownerless. But in the Hebrew, it stays as ownerless. And by the way, when I was in rabbinical school, hefker was the name of the lost and found. You lost a bottle, it'd go on the hefker table. And people,
remember,
ownerless stuff. Yeah.
Well, and God says to the Israelites, I will be your God and you will be my people. There's a mutual ownership of each other there.
The greatest challenge for those of us who wish to acquire Torah to absorb Torah, to drink it in like that water when we're feeling dehydrated. The greatest challenge of that is to figure out, what does it mean to make oneself hefker? Because according to the Midrash Rabbah, you have to be Bamidbar hefker. Like the wilderness, you have to be ownerless. In what way are we not hefker? By what? By whom? By own? How does this ownership that we have, all the different parts of society that we've agreed to, all the different norms and understandings and shrews that we've bought into, how does that create a roadblock on acquiring wisdom? This is counterintuitive to the way I often think, because I see many traditions and perspectives and views as ways that build us into teaching, into learning. But what happens when we have to stop and think, do some of the universal truths that we've learned, do some of the things that we've been taught by others, may they actually be roadblocks from our absorption of our text? And what do we do with that? Can you think of something that you hold dear that you think may actually stop you from other forms of learning and interpretation? Susan?
All my early Torah study, all my early Jewish learning was High German Reform. I was taught that kosher was outdated health laws, and it was religious for me to be not kosher. I was taught that the Torah is a historical story, and looking at it for more meaning was also new to me, despite many years of Torah study. I was in the Torah study club at Temple Beth Israel. So for me, really, sometimes I feel like a born-again Jew, really embracing all the beautiful aspects of more observant Judaism has been a revelation.
A revelation that I think, Susan, you should be holding both directions. The amount of people I know whose own upbringing, their own Jewish experience that their parents set forth for them, may be the very roadblock of acquiring wisdom that it takes for them later, because we have to figure out what works in each of our interpretations. One of the things we often talk about when we do conversions in our tradition is that one of the teachings of the rabbis is that someone who chooses to convert to Judaism is a quote unquote better Jew than someone born into Judaism. Now, this line gets twisted a lot, so I don't want us to over focus on that piece. But what they're saying is one who takes the worldly lessons they've already known and finds the truth of Torah and chooses that truth brings with them a much deeper commitment and understanding to its truths, because they had to make the conscious choice. And I often will teach with people who are just simply a roadblock. But Rabbi, I need to get a traditional ketubah. I say, okay, what do you do? Well, I'm an executive. This is the bride. I said, okay, you know that the traditional ketubah, he's going to buy you. And they say, oh, I know, but tradition. We have to keep that part. It would upset my parents so much. And I said, do your parents speak Aramaic? And they said, no. I said, then I don't think they're going to mind what the ketubah says at all. But they get so hung up on this idea that what they had been taught is the only truth that they're completely missing what the rabbis actually hold dear when it comes to the study of our text. If you see one truth from something and it eclipses your ability to be emptied enough and ownerless enough to absorb all the wisdom and truth of Torah, you have sold short the opportunity of connection and learning. Our own tradition can be the very roadblock we're talking about. There's a question as to why Torah was given in the desert, Bamidbar. Now, some will answer that we are Bamidbar, like the desert, and therefore we receive in the desert. But if you want a practical answer, because I know some of you like to grab onto it, there's also the side of the democratization of our experience. If the Torah was given in Israel, what would have probably happened? It would have been given in one of the territories, meaning one of the tribes would have been the tribe that got the opportunity to receive Torah on their land. And if you do that, if that happened, they would have prior claim to the text. And that would create an issue when it comes to the way in which all the tribes of Israel can engage. So not only are we giving Torah because of the experience of the desert, not only because of the beauty and the vastness of desert, but for the chance of making sure that we stay fair to all the groups, Torah was not received in Israel. So here's a thought for discussion. According to that midrash, the Torah was given in the wilderness so that no one would have the ownership. What more, if that's the case, then who is it owned by? Who owns Torah?
All of us.
Okay. But what are we called as Jews? One of the many names for the Jews are the people of the book. Torah is often assigned to us as our sacred words, whereas others turn to needing a second volume and a third volume, where others weren't satisfied with A New Hope and had to go to Empire Strikes Back. The Jews said this was enough. But whose is it? Is it the Jews? Does Torah belong to the Jewish people?
I would say yes, but not only
Okay.
to the Jewish people.
Now, some of you that when you're in person talk more are being rather quiet on this Zoom. So I ask, do you think that the Jewish people have claim to Torah?
No.
Then what is our relationship to our text? I think you might be right, but we need to find the answer here. If we don't own Torah, if Torah doesn't belong to the Israelite people, to the Jews of the world, then what is our relationship to our sacred text?
We're the people that choose to learn from it.
Okay. Our chosenness is a choosing Torah. Okay. Sure.
And even the blessing we say after reading the Torah is thanking God for giving us the Torah. God gave it to us, we say.
On Mount Sinai, the revelation, God gives the Israelites the Torah.
Right. I mean, that's what the story is. But wasn't there a midrash that said God gave it to like 70 other peoples? And everybody
one of my favorite midrashes. It turns out God has been trying to unload this Torah thing for a while, and no one seems to want it. Every time God says, do you want it? They hear about it. They go, wow, that sounds amazing. And God says, here's what it's going to come with. And they go, no, thank you. And finally, the Israelites are walking Bamidbar. And God takes Sinai and lifts it over their heads and says, do you want to be the chosen people? Do you want my sacred text? And the people look up, and there's a mountain floating above their heads. It's pretty obvious now. You either choose or you lose. And so that midrash shares the idea that it was never a choice at all, and that God coerced the Jewish people into holding the Torah. I don't love that midrash, but I do love the illustration of like God picking up an entire mountain and holding it over a people. But what does it even mean to have that choice? We wrestle with this all the time. But if you're chosen to have the words of Torah, do you own Torah? You just said it, Bert. God gives Torah on Mount Sinai. So do the Jews own the Torah?
Or does Torah own the Jews? I mean, you can look at two different strains in Torah. One is the story of a people, and the other is what is expected of those people. And those are two different things. I mean, in the sense that this is the story of the Jewish people, I don't know. I mean, it's our story. I mean, that's I don't know that it's true or not, but that is our story. The other piece is the teaching of the Torah and the morals and the ethics and how you should make a society. And I would say, I don't know that we own it, but I would say that was given to us as guidance, Eitz Chaim, the tree of life. And it is our choice as to whether we do anything with it, whether we follow it or not.
The Midrash would have us believe that we need to be Bamidbar Hefker, that we need to be like the wilderness, unowned, wild.
We need to make the choice.
We need to make the choice. I would go one step further. What if the Midrash is wrong? What if the Midrash is wrong on one small step, the subject of their interpretation? For many of you who are artists, writing, painting, sculpting, what is the scariest part about putting your product out to the world?
Whether it'll be accepted or not.
How it'll be interpreted.
Do people understand the interpretation and representation that I was going for? At one point, about 7-8 years ago, I think, J.K. Rowling had a kind of an online spat with someone where she said, that's not what I meant in the book. And the fan said, too late. You put the book out. Now it's our turn to understand what you wrote, and you don't get to redictate how it's interpreted if you didn't make it clear inside the book. When an artist puts all of their love and soul into their work and puts it out, who owns the work? I mean, this is a very real question today. It's why museums are as funded as they are, because people believe that some of the greatest art in this world needs to be open to the public and that no one should own certain art. But more than that, for the artist, when you put your work, your labor of love into this world, you run a risk. You've made this thing beautiful, but you've also made it ownerless. Now people get to interpret that gift how they want. What if this isn't about the Israelite people? What if this idea of hefker is actually telling us how we hold Torah? That Torah is Bamidbar hefker. That Torah is like the wilderness, ownerless and vast and open and explorative and has space for whatever we're going to need to hold, but also has its own real truth in it too. The desert isn't a blank space. There's plenty of life in the desert, but there's also space for us and life in that desert. What if the rabbis aren't talking about us and our ability to receive Torah? What if the rabbis are warning us about the necessity of keeping Torah ownerless, making sure that no one lays such a stronghold claim that they cut off another person's ability to interpret our text? Because how sad would it be for us as a people if all the best ways to interpret our sacred words were already over? That's for the ultra-Orthodox to believe. That's for those who believe that we are going further and further away from holiness to believe that the depth of interpretation is already behind us. But we don't believe that. We believe that every time we read Torah, what we aren't its owner. We're its interpreter. We speak its truth into this world. We're its megaphone. We're its agent. We're its publicist. We're whatever you want to call it. We make sure that the words of Torah can be heard throughout the world. But we do not own it. And we cannot stifle the ability for others to find truth inside its words. There's a danger to that. There's some fear involved in that. But think of all the times that you've grabbed onto something and found it so powerful. If our text had a one way to read it, we wouldn't be reading it this year. We wouldn't be reading it next year. We wouldn't read it every single year. Every time we read our text, we get the chance to breathe new life based on where we're at in this world. And so I don't know if the rabbi's whole thread of thinking is right. I don't know if this idea that what we already know blocks us from the ability to see Torah. I actually think the true answer is our obligation in this world is to make sure that Torah remains nimble enough that every time we learn in this world, we use that learning to find a deeper sense of truth in our text. That is a holy responsibility. That is a chosen task that we take on. That makes us the people who hold dear and nurture its text, but not the ones who can so blindly think that we have its whole truth already inside. Any thoughts, pushback? Rabbi, I fervently disagree, but thanks for saying it that way. I'm always open to that. Who thinks of Torah as ownerless? Is there anything else in this world that you really consider ownerless?
I'm not sure the issue is who owns Torah. I think you hit on the issue, and that is, does anybody own interpretation of Torah? And that, to me, I think you've stated extremely well really what the situation is. And I think that was the position of the rabbis, I mean, in the end, that nobody can say this is my Torah and I know everything about it and my interpretation is the only way to go. So I thought you stated that very well, and I totally agree with what you said. So I'm sorry if I can't disagree.
I accept your apology for non-combativeness. I think that we often assume, and I felt trapped a little bit in this time together, that it's only the liberal strands of Judaism that understands this multifaceted voice. But that's also not true, because in all forms of our tradition, we always hear about multiple rabbis' perspectives. They may not agree with each other. They may even curate which ones we get the chance to hear. But it's always been a part of our process to hear multiple interpretations of our faith. And by doing so, even if they never say it, they don't say it in the opening words of Talmud, Giving you multiple perspectives is telling you that even though today there's an answer, the answer might change and you need to know how to interpret it. You need to know how to navigate that desert, and you need to know how to find that water. That's what we need to do. And so we are always giving multiple resources and perspectives and abilities to do that. Yeah, Susan.
Just that Lord Rabbi Sachs was Orthodox and to me is one of the most profound of the modern sages. And I read something from him almost every day. So, if I closed myself off and I said, oh, I'm Reconstructionist, what do the Orthodox have to offer? I'd be closing myself off from words of wisdom.
I would add, as Ben Zoma says in the Talmud, who is wise? A person who learns from everybody, and not just from people we necessarily agree with.
So let's close this thought this way. Thank you, Bert. After 400 years of slavery, after the whole story of the Exodus, and then making their way to understand what it would take to truly elevate that tent to something sacred, the children of Israel need the time and the space to become the nation that will be that platform of Torah. For the laws, for the social responsibilities, for all these times, they need some time. And so every year, as they progress through the desert, they are slowly creating the foundation to be the very people. And if we take that same idea and we understand what will emerge from the quiet, from the calm, from the less than exciting parts that barely get uttered in the reading of our text, then we will create the space necessary for us to find the voice, to move into the words of Deuteronomy, to move into that powerful impact reminder, and to become the kind of people and to become the safeguard of Torah that we want to be. Bamidbar may not have as much of an identity as the other 4 books do in some ways, but what it is truly the desert. It's the space and it's the openness to grow into the people that we need to be.